Okay. So have you ever, like, totally misjudged someone? It's happened to all of us, right? And this deep dive is going to be all about how pressure can really reveal someone's character and why maybe we shouldn't always trust those first impressions.
Yeah, it's kind of like you don't really know someone until you've seen how they act when things get tough, right? But is that really true?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what we're going to be looking at today. And to help us unpack all this, we've got this guide for practicing English conversation skills. It might sound kind of boring, but stick with me. There's actually some really fascinating psychology in here.
That's good. I'm interested.
Okay, so the guide starts off with this conversation between these two people named Emily and Tom, and they're talking about their coworker, Jenny.
Okay.
And at first, they both thought Jenny was amazing, like super calm and cool and collected, the kind of person you'd want on your team.
Yeah, for sure.
But then this tough situation comes up, and suddenly Jenny's not handling it so well. And Tom even says something like, "It's interesting to see how people respond under pressure, isn't it? That's when their true nature comes out." So what do you think about that? Is someone's true nature only revealed when they're stressed out?
That's a good question. I think it raises a bigger point about what we even mean by true colors, you know? Like if someone freaks out under pressure, is that really who they are, or is it just a temporary reaction? And what about people who totally rise to the occasion? Are they showing their true colors too, or is it way more complicated than that?
Right. Because we've all had those moments where we haven't exactly been our best selves under pressure, right? I know I have. But does that one instance define who we are as a person? I don't think so.
No, definitely not. It's way more nuanced than just good or bad, you know? When we're under pressure, our brains get flooded with all these hormones like cortisol and adrenaline.
Yeah.
And these hormones trigger our fight, flight, or freeze response. And that can make us act in ways we wouldn't normally.
So you're saying it's almost like our brain goes into survival mode, and sometimes that means we just react without thinking.
Exactly. Some people might get more assertive or even aggressive, while others might completely withdraw or become super passive. It really depends on the person, their personality, how they cope with stress, and even their cultural background.
That's interesting. And that's where I think those second thoughts come in, right? It's that moment where you're like, wait a minute, I thought I knew this person, and you start to question your initial impression of them.
Yeah, definitely. Second thoughts can be a really valuable sign that we need to pause and reevaluate the situation. Maybe we didn't have all the information, or maybe our own biases were clouding our judgment. It's a chance to step back and say, okay, maybe there's more to this than I initially thought.
And this guide actually dives into some really interesting vocabulary about this. It talks about the power of impressions. How quickly we form them and how much weight we give them, even if they're based on very little information.
It's true. Think about it. When you meet someone for the first time, your brain is processing tons of information all at once, their appearance, their body language, their tone of voice. And within seconds, you've already formed an impression, often without even realizing it.
So it's like our brains are trying to categorize people and situations super fast, almost like a shortcut to make sense of the world.
Exactly. But the problem is those shortcuts can sometimes lead us in the wrong direction. We might fall into these cognitive biases, like confirmation bias, where we only look for information that confirms our existing beliefs, even if it's not totally accurate.
So we're basically cherry-picking evidence to support our first impressions, even if it's not the full picture.
Right. And then there's the halo effect, where we assume that if someone is attractive or successful in one area, they must also be intelligent or trustworthy. But of course, those assumptions are always true.
It's amazing how much our brains are doing behind the scenes without us even knowing.
Yeah, and that's where this whole idea of under pressure gets really interesting, because what one person considers pressure might be totally different for someone else.
Yeah, like for some people, public speaking is terrifying, but for others, it's no big deal.
Exactly. So it's not just about the external situation, but also how we perceive it and react to it internally. Some people thrive in high-pressure environments, while others just shut down completely. It's all part of what makes us human, you know?
And what's interesting is that this whole under pressure thing isn't just about those big dramatic life events. It can be as simple as making a tough decision or having a difficult conversation or even just trying to meet a deadline at work.
Absolutely. We experience pressure in so many different ways throughout our day. And how we react to those pressures can tell us a lot about ourselves, how we cope with stress, our values, and even our underlying beliefs about the world.
So what you're saying is that pressure can actually be a good thing. Like it can help us learn about our strengths and weaknesses and how we show up in the world.
I think there's a lot of truth to that, but it's also important to remember that those reactions don't define us as people. They're just one piece of the puzzle.
Okay, so if we're forming these quick impressions and then seeing how people react under pressure, how do we know when to trust our gut and when to take those reactions with a grain of salt? Is there even a right answer?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's something we're going to keep exploring in this deep dive.
It's like we're always trying to figure people out, right? Like who they really are. But this deep dive is making me think that maybe it's less about figuring them out and more about just recognizing that people are complicated. We're all constantly changing. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. We tend to want to put people into these neat little boxes, but the truth is humans are messy and contradictory and always evolving. So what we might see as someone's true colors could just be a tiny glimpse of them in one specific moment, shaped by all these factors that we don't even know about.
It's like that saying, don't judge someone until you've walked a mile in their shoes.
Right.
We never really know what someone else is going through, the challenges they're facing, the pressures they're dealing with.
Exactly. And that brings us back to something this conversation guide asks. Is it fair to judge someone solely based on how they act under pressure? It's a tough one because on the one hand, yeah, how we react to stress can definitely reveal some patterns in our behavior. But on the other hand, everyone has their breaking point, right? And what might totally overwhelm one person might not even faze someone else.
I'm starting to think that judging someone just on how they handle pressure is like judging a fish on its ability to climb a tree. It's not a fair comparison.
I love that analogy. It really highlights the importance of context, If someone is snapping at their coworkers, maybe they're not just a jerk. Maybe they're dealing with a sick kid or financial problems or a million other things that are pushing them to their limit. And if we can stop and consider those possibilities, it might completely change our perspective.
It's like the difference between seeing someone's behavior as a personal flaw versus seeing it as a symptom of something bigger. And that shift in perspective can make a huge difference in how we treat them.
Absolutely. Instead of writing someone off as difficult or whatever, we can try to approach them with curiosity and compassion.
Yeah.
Ask ourselves what might be going on in their life that's causing them to act this way.
This reminds me of this one time when I totally misjudged a coworker. He was always super quiet and reserved in meetings, so I just assumed he wasn't really engaged. But then we had to work on a project together, and I saw a totally different side of him. He was brilliant and insightful, and even had a great sense of humor. It turned out he was just really introverted and felt more comfortable expressing himself one-on-one.
That's a perfect example of how limiting it can be to judge someone based on just a small part of their behavior. We all have different comfort zones and communication styles and ways of dealing with stress. And what might seem like a negative trait in one situation could actually be a strength in another.
It makes you realize how much we miss out on when we judge people too quickly. We could be overlooking hidden talents or unique perspectives or even potential friendships.
And that's why it's so important to be open to those second thoughts. They're not just about doubting our decisions. They're about being open to new information, changing our minds, and allowing people to surprise us.
So in a way, second thoughts were actually a good thing. They're a sign that we're humble enough to admit we don't have all the answers and that we're willing to be wrong.
Exactly. And that willingness to be wrong, to admit that our first impressions might have been off, is so important for personal growth and for building better relationships.
And that brings us back to another question from this guide about what qualities are revealed when people are stressed. It asks if those qualities are their true selves or just a temporary reaction. What do you think?
Well, I think it's probably a bit of both, Pressure can definitely make certain tendencies stronger. Like if someone has a short fuse, they're probably more likely to lose their temper under stress, but it can also reveal hidden strengths and weaknesses that we wouldn't normally see.
So it's like pressure acts as a magnifying glass, making certain parts of our personality stand out more. It doesn't necessarily change who we are deep down, but it can highlight certain traits that might have been hidden before.
Exactly. And those traits could be good or bad. Someone who's usually shy and quiet might suddenly become a leader when faced with a crisis. But on the flip side, someone who's normally calm and collected might completely fall apart under pressure.
It's interesting how pressure can bring out the best or the worst in people, depending on the person and the situation. It's like pressure is a test, but we don't always know what it's testing for.
And what's even more interesting is that those tests can happen in all sorts of situations. It's not just about those big life-changing moments. It's about all those everyday challenges that push us outside our comfort zones, make us face our fears, and ultimately help us grow.
So even those small moments of pressure, like giving a presentation at work or having a tough conversation with someone we care about, can actually be opportunities to learn and grow.
Absolutely. They can teach us about our resilience, our ability to adapt, and our capacity to handle whatever challenges life throws at us.
But this is also making me think about the other side of that.
Yeah.
If pressure can reveal certain things about us, what does that say about the environments we create for ourselves and the people around us? Like if we're constantly surrounded by stress and negativity, are we more likely to show our worst side? And if we can create more supportive and understanding environments, can we encourage people to be their best selves?
That's a really powerful question and one that's worth exploring more. But before we do that, let's quickly recap what we've talked about so far. We've covered the psychology of first impressions, the effects of pressure on behavior, and the importance of having second thoughts. We've explored the idea that true colors are way more complex than we might think, and that everyone has a limit. But where do we go from here? How can we use all of this to better understand ourselves and the people around us? That's what we'll be diving into in the last part of this episode.
You know, it's funny, we talk about someone showing their true colors like it's this big reveal. Like there's this hidden self that's always been there just waiting to come out. But what if our true colors are actually always changing? Like what if they're shaped by our experiences and the people around us?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. You're right. Our true selves aren't fixed. We're always adapting and learning and growing. And how we express ourselves, especially under pressure, is really influenced by the social and cultural norms around us.
So it's not just about our individual personalities, but also about the unspoken rules of how we're supposed to act in certain situations.
Exactly. Think about it. In some cultures, it's considered super rude to show strong emotions in public, while in others, it's totally normal to be more expressive. So someone who might seem really reserved in one culture could be seen as cold or uncaring in another. It all depends on the context.
That makes me wonder if we're sometimes getting people's true colors wrong just because we're looking at them through the lens of our own cultural expectations.
It's definitely a possibility. We all have our own biases and assumptions based on how we were raised, our social circles, even the media we consume. And those biases can affect how we think people should behave, especially when they're under stress.
This deep dive has really made me realize how important it is to be aware of those biases, not just when we're judging other people, but also when we're thinking about ourselves. We might be holding ourselves to impossible standards or being way too hard on ourselves for reactions that are totally normal under the circumstances.
It's true. We're often much harder on ourselves than we are on other people. We might beat ourselves up for making a mistake when we're stressed, but then be totally understanding and compassionate when someone else does the same thing.
It's like we have this double standard where we expect ourselves to be perfect, but we allow other people to be human. And that doesn't seem very fair, does it?
Not at all. And it can lead to a lot of self-criticism and unnecessary stress. So maybe the first step is to start treating ourselves with the same kindness and understanding that we offer to others. Realize that we're all still learning and growing, and that making mistakes under pressure is just part of that process.
That's a really good point. And it makes me think about how we can create environments that encourage that kind of self-compassion, both for ourselves and for the people around us. If we're constantly surrounded by judgment and negativity, it's no wonder people are afraid to let their guard down and be themselves.
Absolutely. If we want people to feel comfortable being authentic, we need to create spaces where they feel safe, to be vulnerable, to mess up, and to ask for help when they need it.
And that's important in all parts of our lives, right?
Yeah.
Not just at work, but also in our personal relationships. It's about building connections based on trust and understanding, where people feel like they can be themselves, even when they're not feeling their best.
Exactly. And it's about realizing that everyone has something valuable to offer, even if it doesn't always come out in the most perfect way.
This whole conversation has really changed my perspective. I'm starting to see pressure not as something to avoid, but as a chance to learn and connect with people, and even discover new things about myself. What about you? What's your biggest takeaway from this deep dive?
For me, it's just remembering that judging people, especially based on how they act under pressure, is way more complicated than it seems. It's about understanding that everyone's different and that what we see on the surface might not be the whole story.
So next time you see someone showing their true colors, maybe take a second before you judge them. Ask yourself, what might be going on in their life? What's the context here? And am I letting my own biases affect how I'm seeing this? You might be surprised by what you realize.
And, maybe, just maybe, by being a little more understanding and forgiving, you can create a space where someone feels safe enough to be their true self. Not just the side that comes out when things are tough, but the side that makes them truly shine.
That's a great thought to end on. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive. And to all of you listening out there, we hope this conversation has given you some things to think about how you judge others and maybe even how you judge yourselves. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and remember to embrace the incredible complexity of being human.